Our Syrian Democratic Force partners are keeping pressure on ISIS, advancing toward the confluence of the Khabur and Euphrates River valleys, thus far clearing more than 4,000 square kilometers since beginning of operations in September. We've not shown a graphic since my last Pentagon press briefing about a month ago, so we'll show two slides covering 16 October to 13 November. So I want to just make sure that you see right now the first map that shows from the last time over a 2-week period. So you should be looking at the SDF's progress to the 31st of October. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. And you should now be looking at a map from 16 to 13 November, which shows the progress. The coalition continues supporting our Syrian partners through surveillance and combat advice, as well as more than 40 precision strikes in the past week, targeting ISIS fighters, weapons, logistics, and command nodes. We will continue to deprive ISIS remnants of their resources and safe havens and continue our Defeat ISIS mission so long as they pose a threat. Even as we remain focused on the defeat and destruction of ISIS, the coalition is supporting stabilization efforts so Syrian cities like Raqqa and Tabqa can recover after years of fighting and brutal ISIS occupation. To ensure lasting security and safety so residents can return home, we continue supporting local solutions such as the Raqqa Internal Security Force, which includes more than 2,000 coalition-trained members from the surrounding areas. They are now working directly with the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, to cordon off dangerous areas and clear explosives and booby traps left behind by ISIS terrorists. We anticipate the fielding and training of security forces such as the RISF, that they will grow in importance, and as ISIS's conventional force continues to face defeat and reverts to its terrorist roots. The coalition will continue to support our partners, their needs for effective forces tailored to meet the needs of the Syrian and Iraqi people. As explosive remnants of war are carefully cleared, residents can begin to return home. This week, thanks to coalition-enabled efforts, nearly 8,000 civilians were able to return to their homes in Mislib after the Syrian Democratic Forces cleared the area. The inclusive and locally governed Raqqa Civil Council has led the way in public health, safety, economic, and educational efforts in the area, with continued support from the coalition. As an example, coalition members delivered interagency emergency health kits to the Tabqa General Hospital in support of the Raqqa Civil Council's health care initiative. These kits provide approximately 2 months of emergency medical supplies to those in need in Tabqa, to include IDPs from Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor residing in nearby camps. The Raqqa Civil Council also facilitated the opening of a municipal building that provides essential services in Karma, a sign that a city is returning to normal operations. Many of these stabilization efforts in Syria are coordinated through the U.S. State Department's Syrian Transition Assistance and Response Team, or START, and they support the locally led civil councils. Moving to Iraq, our partners in the Iraqi security forces continue steady progress in their clearance of Western Anbar province, targeting ISIS in their final remaining holdouts in Iraq. In the past week, they have completed back clearance operations in Al-Qaim, eliminating ISIS weapons caches, including IEDs and mortars. As the ISF secure and hold these recently cleared areas, they are also continuing their advance against ISIS in the city of Rawa. As with all these operations, planned and executed by the capable ISF, the coalition continues to provide intelligence, advice, and support. To that end, we have conducted 6 strikes against ISIS in Rawa during the past week, targeting tactical units and fighting positions. With regards to relations between the governments in Baghdad and Erbil, we reiterate the importance of continued dialogue. We have seen recently, when military attention and security resources are diverted from the fight against ISIS, that terrorist groups seize on opportunities to launch attacks against civilians and security forces. As with Syria, areas liberated of ISIS still require attention to ensure lasting security and to set conditions for long-term stabilization. Therefore, we continue to support development of our ISF partner forces. At the same time, the global coalition is working with the government of Iraq to support various economic and education initiatives. A number of rehabilitation projects are restoring essential services. Renovations to the main hospital in Sharqat are complete. 4 public health centers and the Sharqat Health Management Building are also complete and are ready to be handed over to the Directorate of Health. Ongoing UNDP cash for work activities include the cleanup of the Al Jadid area in western Mosul, which is employing 200 workers, while other projects include cleanup of Nineveh University. USAID funding is helping rehabilitate the Tikrit water network and an electricity substation, 3 schools, 100 small business grants for micro and small enterprises, and cash for work emergency employment for debris removal, solid waste collection, and minor repairs to damaged houses. UNDP estimates more than 60,000 residents in Tikrit now have access to clean water, and 50,000 residents have electricity in their homes as a result of this initiative. Across Iraq, we are seeing this kind of progress and stabilization. To consolidate and secure these gains, we must remain committed to ensuring long-term security, which will require the united efforts of Iraqi security forces and partners of the global coalition. Customary for many of my briefings, I will close with providing the newest names of Daesh associates who are no longer leading fellow terrorists. Yusuf Demir, an ISIS militant tied to media operations and ISIS terror networks throughout the Middle East and Europe, was killed by a coalition airstrike on October 26th. He was killed while traveling with his brother Omer Demir, also an ISIS external operations coordinator with links to ISIS networks in the Middle East and Europe. Abu Yazin, an ISIS senior leader and weapons facilitator, was killed in an airstrike on November 3rd near Mayadin, Syria. And finally, Abdullah Hajoui, a Syrian-based ISIS operative, was killed by a coalition airstrike on November 5th near Abu Kamal, Syria. Hajoui facilitated external attack plotting with ISIS terrorists in multiple countries. These are 3 more ISIS high-value individuals of 117 who have been hunted down and killed by the coalition this year. Our professionals are constantly looking for Daesh leaders, to include Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And to preempt questions, we do not know where Baghdadi is. We're looking for him, and if we find him, we'll be after him. Allow me to reiterate that despite recent and significant military successes against Daesh, the threat of its hateful ideology persists. We must and will pursue them, and we will remain committed to partner support that enables the enduring defeat of these criminals. We are proud to stand by our Iraqi and Syrian partners as they continue to strive toward a better life for future generations.
I'm sure you saw our report, which demonstrated that a lot of fighters were allowed to leave Raqqa in the last month. I'm just wondering if you know how many foreign fighters were in the buses and trucks, and was the coalition aware that tons of ammunition and weaponry were smuggled out in the same convoy?
To go back and to reiterate and to talk about Quinton's article, this was not a secret, and the information that we provided on the 10th and the 14th in the form of press releases and my open statements and interviews with the media had talked about a lot of the agreement that was made between the Raqqa Civil Council, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the tribal elders in that area. So to address number one, the foreign fighters, when the civilians that were coming out of Raqqa as a part of this agreement for the sole purpose of stopping or saving civilians to prevent any further civilian casualties as a result of the conflict, as they were coming out, there was a agreement that was made that ISIS-aged males or civilians that came out would be screened and would be, and also we would take biometrical data from them, screen them to see if they were in our system, and then if not, to be processed in that system. In the course of that screening, there were 4 foreign fighters that were identified and were detained by the Syrian Democratic Forces. Out of the 3,500 civilians that came out of the Raqqa at that time, approximately less than 300 were identified and screened as potential ISIS fighters. So I think without going on much further, I'll go ahead and address that. I'll go ahead and ask for a follow-up or ask if you need any more clarification.
Thank you very much for that. That's a comprehensive answer. I'm just wondering if you were aware about the buses and trucks carrying tons of ammunition and weaponry as well that were smuggled out in the same convoy. Were you aware of that in advance?
So what we understand was there was the 3,500 family members and the 300 ISIS fighters. We were not aware of, and certainly cannot corroborate the amount that was described in the story, nor can we also corroborate the statements that were made by those bus drivers. So we followed these buses as they departed the Raqqa area, and as with other events like these, if opportunities presented themselves to conduct strikes against any potential ISIS fighters that had decided to flee, then we would have provided strikes. That did not present itself, and there were many civilians that were part of that convoy, so that did not happen.
So back in 17 October, when you briefed us, and then also the press releases came out on 14 and 10 of October, we're saying that there was an arrangement, or there was some kind of an effort by the SDF to help the civilians who are stranded in the city out of the city to the safety, to safe areas. And then you also mentioned at the time that 350 ISIS militants have surrendered to the SDF at the time. But the BBC story does not say that it was a surrender or it was kind of a rescue operation. Rather, there was an agreement with the militants in Raqqa city, and then with the SDF and the Arab elders, whoever they are, and then they smuggled fighters, they smuggled weapons out of the city. So that's I think the way that you express the thing and the way that the BBC story is saying are similar. I think somehow different things or different conceptualizations. They are claiming that those fighters run or escaped the city and then went somewhere else, while your statement says they were detained or they were there under detention of SDF. Can you clarify these differences between your statement and then whatever the BBC story is saying?
I caught most of that, and I think the way that we'll address that is that there were surrenders that happened both before the agreement and after the agreement. So I know that prior to that agreement being made, there were about 4 to 5 ISIS fighters per week that had been identified to include emirs, to include some of the leaders in that area, and they were either captured trying to escape by blending in with civilians, or they turned themselves in. Then we had the agreement that, as we stated, for much throughout that entire period, that while we had an opportunity to present our position on what they wanted to do, we were not active participants in those discussions. And then after that agreement was made, after the buses had departed, there were an additional about 100 ISIS fighters that had surrendered after the fact. So during these very short amount of time, during this week, and was a lot of people that were turning themselves and surrendering. So I don't know if there was confusion with that, but I know that we were open with the number of civilians and the number of fighters that had been a part of this arrangement.
Can you say that no ISIS fighters escaped or kind of found their way out of the city within the scope of this agreement? So based on this agreement, they were not allowed to leave the cities and go somewhere else. Can you say that?
We are always going to do our very best, and our partners are going to do our very best to identify fighters. When you have thousands of people that are coming out of a city, there have been those that even prior to that were also blowing themselves up. But regardless, I can't say with a 100% certainty that every single fighter was identified coming out of Raqqa. And that's either leading up to this agreement or even prior to, with the other civilians that were able to break out and to get free.
And then the other question, just one more question, sorry. About the Raqqa Internal Security Forces, can you tell us what is the composition of this force?
The Raqqa Internal Security Force operates in and around the environs of Raqqa. They maintain checkpoints. They have gone on patrols. So they play a myriad of different roles with the security in and around Raqqa. They work for the Raqqa Civil Council. I know that they are also doing their very best to prevent civilians from danger as civilians are attempting to move back into their homes. And I've gotten reports on that to say Raqqa Internal Security Force, because they are from the area and the surrounding areas, are being very effective with the interaction that they have with the Raqqawis from the area.
How many ISIS fighters have been detained? Do you have a specific number? And how many ISIS detainees are in U.S. custody or are being interrogated under the U.S. military?
Don't have number of total ISIS detainees. So if we're talking Iraq and or Syria, because the Syrian Democratic Forces or the Iraqi security forces, they maintain any of those who have been detained. And regarding your second question about American citizens that have been detained, that is a question for the State Department on any kind of repatriation or anything that is happening with American citizens in Iraq or in Syria.
You meant both in Syria and Iraq. How many ISIS fighters are in U.S. custody now, are being interrogated under the supervision of the U.S. military?
As far as I know, right now there are no ISIS detainees that are underneath American detention. I will have to go back and check to be 100% on that. But what I understand right now is that we do not have anybody in custody.
No one of those who are being detained by the SDF is a high-value target, maybe close to Baghdadi, for example?
Mr. Tabbitt, I don't know. So again, if the Syrian Democratic Forces or the Iraqi security forces have any kind of detainees or high-value individuals, they can be questioned. And if we have information that leads that we can exploit, either through what they have on their person, then we will use that to identify and find other ISIS targets, to include Baghdadi. But as of right now, I do not know of any ISIS members that are being detained by U.S. forces.
You emphasize the importance of continued dialogue between Baghdad and Erbil. Could you elaborate on that? And particularly, I know you've undertaken mediation efforts to stop the fighting between the Iraqi and Peshmerga forces. Could you give us some insights into that mediation effort?
What I would say is that, just because I know that that is a topic of interest, it continues to be a topic of interest here in Iraq. Well, certainly prior to the earthquake, but that is a continuing beat of what is in the news. So I address that because it's a good sign that dialogue continues. So that is kind of where that's why I brought it up in the first place. Number two on that is that there has been fewer face-to-face meetings, but I understand that they are in constant dialogue over the phone on working towards a resolution for the posture in northern Iraq.
Coalition officers involved in mediating those discussions between Baghdad, between the Iraqi and Peshmerga forces?
We did have U.S. Or coalition general officers that were present for some of these meetings. I think you even had General Gerard here a couple of weeks ago who said that he personally was sitting in on some of these meetings. Because of those face-to-face meetings are no longer in effect, I know that our coalition members and leaders are still in contact with Kurdish and with Iraqi security force leaders who are also playing a part in the mediation, in the efforts to to come to a final solution on what is going to happen going forward.
Thank you. And my second question has to do with Abu Kamal. And last week, there was a claim that Syrian forces from Syria, including Lebanese Hezbollah, and then Iraqi forces, the Shiite militias, and specifically the two that the House has identified in a bill as Iranian proxies, that they had liberated Abu Kamal. And I wonder if you had any advanced knowledge of that operation.
We don't have information on that operation. I would also say that I think that there still remains a fight in Abu Kamal. So despite what was said earlier by the Syrian regime, I think that they have not liberated that area. The other thing is that to touch on a quote that I have seen recently, that the Prime Minister Abadi has said that any Iraqi security forces would not participate or not go into Syria, not cross the border. So those elements that fall underneath the Iraqi security forces that go into Syria, they are violating the Prime Minister's direction. And I think that the Iraqi security forces and the government of Iraq have made other statements about what they will do. But the Iraqi security forces, to include the Popular Mobilization Forces, should be falling under and following the directions of the Prime Minister.
Are you confident that the Prime Minister has full control over these militias that were involved with Syria in the effort to liberate Abu Kamal from ISIS?
Yes.
Even though they seem to have acted without his authorization?
Prime Minister Abadi has shown that he is very much capable of leading and doing a very good job of being a commander-in-chief. We have all the confidence in him, and he has made a lot of progress in the fight to defeat ISIS. As we have seen, we're down to the last 1% of the area that remains to be cleared of ISIS. So it was shown that he is very effective, and he has proven that he is a wartime commander-in-chief and has done a very good job.
You talked about the screening process with biometric enrollment with the 300 ISIS-aged fighters. Were there any coalition advisors present for that screening?
There was not. I know that we have provided instructions, and we have also, showed that there was how to use these the equipment to fingerprints for photos, for retina scans, and otherwise. So, not that I know of that there was not coalition presence, or it was the Syrian Democratic Forces that did the screening for these personnel.
You said not that you know of. Is it possible to take the question and find out whether or not there were coalition forces present for that?
I will look into that to see if they were present. I know that they were not actually doing the screening, but whether or not there was someone like we had leaders who were in the room but not active participants, I will look into that and provide you an answer.
And were the convoy itself, was that surveilled by coalition assets after it left Raqqa? I mean, was there efforts to be made to track the movement of the people once they left the city?
Yes, there was, and as I stated previously, with other events similar to this, where we saw a smaller element in Tabqa, and as we saw the other element that happened between the deal that was made with Hezbollah, that had to do with transfer of fighters. We did everything we can at that point to prevent further movement. But with the particular with this agreement and the movement out of Raqqa, there were several family members that were part of the convoy, and they were staying inside of Syria. So if anyone were to move on to other ISIS-held territory, it was just a matter of time before they would have been. We would have fought them again wherever they moved to.
On a different topic, you mentioned the civil councils being set up to govern liberated areas. I also know the SDF have kind of made inroads into the Omar gas fields and some oil fields and some of the other gas fields out east. Who's paying the salaries for officials that are operating on the civil councils? And is the coalition working to help? I know you're talking about helping, or the USAID is helping rebuild areas. Is there an effort to also rebuild some of this oil and gas infrastructure or help get that up and running?
I don't know who pays the Raqqa Civil Council members. I can look into that, but my guess is that I will probably punt that to the Start Forward team. And the same thing goes for putting forth efforts to assist and or repair and or operate the stuff at these oil fields, the equipment that are at these oil fields.
Are you in Syria? Are you scaling down the number of your advisors with the SDF?
Right now, we are not. The fight continues in the Middle Euphrates River Valley. But as we see in Iraq and as we see in Syria, as ISIS continues to lose territory, commanders will make an assessment and will make recommendations to the chain of command to either to say they don't need other further forces, or to perhaps transition for the type of to the type of support that the coalition will provide in the future. So does that mean more niche personnel that are going to help train future RISF or RISF-like elements? That is something that those commanders on the ground, they make those assessments and they make those recommendations to the chain of command for what is needed.
So does it mean that the special operation forces could be sent elsewhere?
I don't want to speculate on anything that could happen. Again, I'll just go back to what I said before. Those commanders will look and see what is happening on the ground. They'll continue to see what is required to military defeat ISIS, and then to help with the enduring defeat of ISIS, and they will tailor their forces accordingly, and will make requests based off of what they know and what they're going to have to put forth towards that future fight.
A report yesterday that in the Syrian town of Afrin, there are Kurdish forces that contributed to the fight to retake Raqqa, and that are there, and that there are Turkish forces nearby that are poised to attack them. Can you confirm any part of that?
I cannot. I can look into that. That is a first that I have heard on that. So if, we'll take that down and look into that for you.
And can you just confirm, generally speaking, what responsibility does the coalition have to protect forces like Kurdish forces, for example, that have contributed to any anti-ISIS operations now?
Is there a responsibility for the coalition to defend or support our partner forces? I would say yes. We have shown and we have proven that we will support our partners. And that partner force is the Syrian Democratic Forces. So does that mean, that is everyone who falls underneath the umbrella of them, the Arabs, the Kurds, the Yazidis, the Christians. Underneath that blanket, as they are fighting against ISIS, we will support them and we will defend them if necessary.
To clarify, Colonel, if any of those forces, any contributing fighting force to the coalition is attacked by somebody other than ISIS, is the coalition still under a responsibility to protect them?
I would say that we will support our partners who are fighting against ISIS. I think we've shown once in the past that with elements who were working out of Tanif, who did not want to fight ISIS and had other endeavors, we cut our ties with them because that's what they wanted to pursue, and then they were not going to be supported by the coalition any further. So I think that indirectly answers your question. If you're not fighting ISIS and you're not working towards the same mission that we are, then you don't get that support.
Can you provide the coalition's assessment or commander's assessment of how many forces are still sort of amassed along some of the border lines between Iraq and the KRG region, particularly in some of the disputed areas, Kirkuk, Sinjar, those sorts of areas? And two, have you seen a uptick, drop in numbers, or have the numbers maintained the same since the temporary ceasefire was called a few weeks ago?
So I'll answer the first one because I think I heard that pretty clearly, and that is the array of forces in northern Iraq. I'm not going to speak on behalf of the KRG or the government of Iraq. What I can say is that coalition forces are not there in a large presence. We do have some training areas that are located in that particular area where we continue to work and train. But as far as the disposition of Iraqi or Kurdish forces, that's not for me to answer. We've not seen much of from our perspective, when we've seen, we've not seen any buildup, if you will, or drawdown, if you will, from either side.
Colonel, you said you are confident that Prime Minister Abadi has full control over those militias crossing into Syria to help Abu Kamal operation. Do you know whether did the Prime Minister Abadi have any role in mobilizing those forces into Syria, or did he approve that movement?
Anything that has to do with the Iraqi forces is completely, those decisions are completely made by the government of Iraq. So I hope that answers your question. We don't have a say in which Iraqi forces go where, in particular the Popular Mobilization Forces. I know that the government of Iraq and the Iraqi security forces know that we are who we can support and who we can't support, and so I think they also are smart to know how to tailor their forces and their efforts so that they can receive that support as they conduct their operations.
The Russian Ministry of Defense put out a statement today accusing the U.S. Air and coalition air forces of helping ISIS around Abu Kamal and using them to promote American interests in the Middle East. Do you have a response to that statement, sir?
I would say that the Russian Ministry of Defense statements are about as accurate as their air campaign, and I think that is a reason for them to start coming out with their latest barrage of lies. They are currently having some setbacks, particularly with the civilian casualty allegations of the 50 who were reportedly killed by their strikes in Aleppo. You've got what happens with their partners in the Syrian regime in Abu Kamal, saying that they liberated the city and they're not in the city and they're still fighting there, and then some setbacks in Deir ez-Zor recently. So I think that this is consistent in that almost anything that comes out of the Russian MOD is suspect and inaccurate. So these are all things I think that they would put out to deflect from their issues and their challenges. I do take comfort in many of the journalists who are in the room there, that when these accusations come, that you see them for what they are, and they are lies, and I appreciate that you almost laughed them off because they are as ridiculous as today's was, as an example. And I certainly can't verify, but I've seen the report that one of the pictures came from a video game. So again, that is pretty consistent with what we have seen come out of Russian MOD as being baseless, inaccurate, and completely false.
Thank you, sir.
If the Iraqi security forces take actions without consulting you, without informing you, like in Abu Kamal, and particularly in this case, the two militias have been identified by the House committee as Iranian proxies, are you not concerned that these movements of forces that you don't know about because you can't deal with them are not part of an Iranian effort to establish that land bridge to the Mediterranean?
What I'll say is that, the government of Iraq is a sovereign country, and they are making these decisions, and they are ordering their Iraqi security forces. This is something that is to be addressed by the government of Iraq and the Iraqi security forces. We will continue to support the Iraqi security forces as they continue to defeat ISIS. So I think that question is best posed to the government of Iraq. Some of the other things that I will point to while we're talking about the Iraqi security forces is that they are continuing to show their ability to take care of and secure their citizens. As a most recent example, we've seen in the pilgrimage that happened in Iraq, which has traditionally had attacks associated with it. This was a massive congregation that traveled through the area, and the Iraqi security forces were able to provide that security. So there are several opportunities to identify and show where the government of Iraq and Iraqi security forces are very capable of maintaining their citizens' safety.
To go back to the Raqqa BBC story just one more time, what do you think explains that discrepancy between 4 foreign fighters and several dozen that's in that reporting?
I had mentioned a little bit earlier, what possibly could have happened. Again, we can't corroborate what those drivers had said, but what I can say is that the screening by the Syrian Democratic Forces, they were looking for this, and a stipulation was that any foreign fighters that were identified would be detained, and that was something that was put into place and was a part of the screening criteria. Whether or not there were some of these fighters that were able to move in with the civilians, or as a local ISIS affiliate, that could have been the case. But this is all speculation on our part, and so I can't make the big difference or tell you why there was a difference between the dozen versus the 4. Thank you very much. And thanks.